everybody. It's Margie Meacham, and this is the Learning to Go podcast. With me today is Erik Vance, the author of Suggestible You, The Curious Science of Your Brain's Ability to Deceive, Transform, and Heal. It's a National Geographic book. And our guest is a science journalist. Erik's written for the National Geographic, of course, Slate, Harper, Scientific American, Nature, the New York Times, you name it. He's a contributing editor at Discover. And he began his career as a biologist, studying dolphin intelligence and coastal ecology, and then found his true passion in journalism, and has really become sort of a translator of science for his audience. In 2012, he was a finalist for the National Magazine Award, and last year, 2015, he won the top prize from the National Association of Science Writers. He lives in Mexico City with his wife and son, and of course travels quite a bit for his work. He's joining us today from Mexico. And I also want to let you know that he and his book will be featured in the December issue of National Geographic, so be watching for that. So welcome, Erik, and I want to jump right into my first question, which is if you could tell us a little bit about your personal story, because as you say in the book, and you refer to it often, you were raised in the Christian Science faith, and then you've made this very interesting movement into a science journal. So if you could talk a little bit about your development as a journalist and how you made that career choice, I think that would be interesting to all of us.
Well, thank you, Margie, for having me, and I'd be happy to. Yeah, I was born into Christian Science and didn't go to a doctor for, gosh, it must have been the first 18 years of my life. I sort of took it for granted, it was one of those things where you don't really think about it when you're in the middle of it. But it's a fascinating religion. It's an American religion that goes back 150 years now, and basically, as people probably know, it involved faith healing. Christian Science, by and large, don't go to doctors. And I got out of the religion in college. I actually went to Christian Science college, and then sort of lost interest. Got interested in a lot of the sciences, and sort of got passionate about biology, and just sort of went on to other things. I actually didn't think about Christian Science for many years, and as I was sort of pursuing a career in biology, and then I became a science writer, and I was at a conference for brain mapping, and I recognized a name from my history, from my past. There was a Christian scientist who had become a scientist and was giving a lecture on the placebo effect, and a light sort of went off in my head. And I always say it's kind of like being a recovering Catholic or a former Catholic studying, the phenomenon of guilt. It seemed like there were so many, potential answers to questions I'd had when I was a kid, healings I'd seen. You grow up and you see these amazing things, and you can't help but have these lingering questions about what was behind these things. And the scientists had the same questions. And so it sort of kicked me off on a 6-year obsession, I guess you'd say, to look at not just placebo effects, but many different ways that our brains are suggestible, and that brain functions affect our bodies. And it turned out that we're at a very special time in the history of science, and that placebo effects have been, they've been used in pharmaceuticals for 50 years. The word's been coined for a couple hundred, and they've been in regular use for thousands of years, right? And yet we're at this point right now where we're finally able to answer some really fundamental questions about it that we've never been able to answer before. And so it's really exciting. And I would never have thought, getting into this project, that I would have been able to answer, or at least pursue, as many questions about my childhood as I have been.
Okay, well, let's jump in and talk about the placebo effect. As you said, it's a term that we're all familiar with, but what did you learn about that?
Well, I learned more than probably I ever wanted to about it. But the biggest thing that I've learned, there's actually should be plural. It's placebo effects, and there's many different kinds, and some of them are sort of statistical, or sort of a regression to the mean, when you you go to the doctor when your sickness is at its worst, and then you feel better because the natural course of the disease. But the ones that really got my attention were the ones that were chemical in nature, where your brain will actually release drugs like opioids to make what you expect become real. And those are the ones that really will blow your mind when you start thinking about. I got hooked up to I can call it an electric chair. I got shocked for half an hour or so at the NIH labs in Bethesda, Maryland. And every time I saw a green screen, I would get a small shock. And every time I saw a red screen, I get a big one. And it was, it was enough to make my foot twitch. It was not comfortable. And then on the last run, they just gave me the big one every time, but they kept changing the lights. And I think you know where this is going, because whenever I saw the green light, I swear I did not feel any pain. It felt like a little pinch, and I was getting the full shock, one that would make my foot twitch. It hurt so much. And basically my brain was dropping in drugs to make up the difference so that what I expected became true. And there's a lot of flexibility that your brain's got to do that, and a lot more than you think. And that was the stuff that really, that sort of chemical nature of placebos. And it's pharmaceutical. They call it the internal pharmacy. That really, really got my attention.
Yeah. And, I related to, as you know, our audience are learning professionals. There's something very similar that happens when you're training people or teaching them something, and it's called the Hawthorne effect, because it was studied in the 1950s in Hawthorne, Illinois, and they had these workers who the only thing they changed, some of them, they were studying the intensity of light, and they would see the guys come in and change the light bulbs, but they actually were getting the same quantity of light. It was just that they saw people changing the light bulbs, and they performed better, because the expectation that, I'm in brighter light, I'm obviously expected to work better, turned them into more productive, more efficient performers. So it's the same kind of thing. There's something going on in the brain that actually produced a physical response.
The Hawthorne effect is a great example of that kind of the kind of thing that pops up a lot in my book.
Oh yeah, and so I think that people with not only is this something that's just generally of interest, but for the learning professional, I think this book has a lot of immediate applications, and that anybody reading it who is from a background like mine, you're an instructional designer, a teacher, a professor, you're going to link it to things you've seen as a teacher.
I've thought a lot about this, and I almost did a story on this, and it actually just got canceled. But we often think of learning as something that happens on a chalkboard in front of us, and then we take in this information and then we use it. But there's another type of learning that I found out about in the process of working on this book, and that's sort of body learning. And we can sort of round it off by calling it classical conditioning, or sort of conditioning. But your body has a lot of different ways. Your brain has a lot of different ways to create shortcuts, to create what psychologists call expectancies. And a lot of what I learned about was sort of a sense of not learning necessarily consciously, but sort of how your body learns to predict what's happening in the world around it. And that's at the heart of a lot of what I talk about.
And I just finished doing a session on the brain's ability to predict and how that affects someone in a learning situation, because we're anticipating. We usually already know where the instructor's headed before they can get the words out. We're always anticipating our world. So what are some of the things in your book that you discovered in this journey? And by the way, you're a very brave guy, letting yourself be zapped and some of these other crazy things you did. But you must have gotten some insights that you can pull together that would matter for somebody who cares about helping someone learn.
Well, I did, and there were a lot of them. I mean, there's the obvious ones, which is I spent a lot of time talking about medicine and your body, but I do have some sections at the end that deal with um, some learning. And I mean, that you sort of psych yourself out or trick yourself into doing all kinds of things. One of the classic sort of small experiments, was if you give someone an MIT pen, they tend to perform better on tests. And the same goes for athletics. If you give someone a colored drink, they tend to perform better because it's sort of the association with Gatorade. But I think what I took from that, and a lot of this health stuff, was the importance of details, the importance of two things really. The first is details. We are constantly taking in information around you, and the messages that we're sending when we're teaching, when we're working with someone, and if we're a doctor, when we're dealing with patients, are a big part of, in the case of the doctor, the cure, and for the educator, maybe the lesson is, can I trust this person? Who is this person? And that has a tremendous power. And if you put a lousy wine into a really nice bottle and put a really nice wine into a beautiful looking bottle, the lousy wine will taste better. And it's not that we say it tastes better, that we try to impress our friends. Like, the science indicates at this point that it actually tastes better. And that's something we have to really absorb. Like, these are tangible effects and these are measurable effects. So that was the first thing. Second thing was narrative. All of this stuff, it depends on the narrative that we hear and the narrative that we tell about ourselves. And I think that's a huge piece of education. I'm sure you've covered on the show with the power of our narrative and the narrative that we're told. And we say things about ourselves in order to sort of make sense of the world and to predict what's coming at us, and it creates these expectancies. And when someone feeds that narrative, it has this ability to affect us, not just a conscious level, but also on a very deep physiological level. And then other people, this is why I think there's so much confusion around, like, alternative medicines, because they just don't work for some people, and then for other people they work marvelously. And it's because it feeds a narrative. That one of the reasons is because it feeds a narrative that we have about ourselves, and that seems to me hugely important to someone in your field.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things is really key to emphasize, because I think it can be lost in all of this, is we're talking about a physiological change. We're talking about neurons reconnecting to each other. We're talking about chemicals being released in your brain. In the past, these kind of things might have been shrugged off as, that's just a psychological effect. It's not real, in other words. But these effects are real. They're measurable. We can see it. We can now watch it actually happening through an fMRI. So, this is the big change. This is the big aha for all of us, is all this stuff we thought was kind of fuzzy, frou-frou out there, stuff going on in someone's head. And we would say, and it's still, when someone says, oh, that's all in your head, they usually mean to discount it. And yet the truth is, it's real. I mean, it is as real as your blood pumping through your heart. It's part of your body.
It is actually real, and it is also all in your head. Both of those things are kind of true.
Yes.
I mentioned, I really think the reason why we haven't heard about this before, the reason why we're hearing about this now, is because for so long, as you said, it was discounted. It was sort of shuffled off as like, oh, it's unknowable. It's sort of the psychology of people. The mind is a powerful thing, and you hear that again and again. And I suppose that's okay, but at this point, that explanation simply isn't good enough. Maybe back then it was okay, but today we have these tools, and there's many different studies that have come out that have really shown the tangibility of this. But I'll go back to sort of the first, the beginning of the 2000s. A couple of teams, one in Sweden and one here in the U.S. Did these? They imaged the placebo effect for the first time, and we had known that it was chemical before then, but it just didn't resonate with people. In fact, we've known that since as long as endorphins have been studied, but it just didn't seem to resonate until we sort of saw it actually how it happens in the brain. And if I could have you just sort of imagine for a second that you burn your hand and then you put it in a bucket of cold water, okay, and you get this relief. And that travels up your hand, goes to your brain, and your brain processes it, and then it tells the front part of your brain, the sort of decision-making, the prefrontal cortex, okay, we're okay, we're in a lot less pain right now, like relax, figure out what to do next. A placebo is almost the exact same kind of thing, only it goes backwards. And you can see this happen in these fMRI experiments where it starts in the front and this sort of thinking prefrontal cortex, and it moves backwards. And then on its way back, it will release drugs that will make what it expects come true. But it's sort of an inverse version. And that is A, really, really cool, and B, measurable and tangible. And I think that's really changed the way we see placebos. Now it's something we can work with, and we can even look at the genetics of it and how that operates. And I think it's hard to, once the genie's out, you can't put him back in the bottle.
Yeah, that's great point. I do believe that what you're kind of hinting at is something that I've mentioned before, is that we're at a really exciting time. We are on the verge of a real significant change in how we view ourselves, how we understand ourselves, and how we take care of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
In your chapter about being more healthy, there's a great line where you say one of the most important things you can do is change the way you think about
Mm-hmm.
your health, and that starts to stimulate your body and stimulate your brain to make the choices differently. So, and that's learning. Learning is all about changing behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Changing behavior now has to include understanding how the brain works down at the molecular and chemical level, so that we can apply these things correctly into the change management types of programs that teachers and corporate trainers are putting together. So go ahead.
I was going to say, you're absolutely right. And what's most, did you talk about living better? One of the things I thought was most interesting in my research was not just that this can happen, like knowing that your mind is a powerful thing, that actually doesn't, for me at least, doesn't really do much for me. But what I was most interested in is are the limitations of this, that you can sort of, the placebo effects and expectation are so powerful with certain conditions, but then almost powerless with other ones. And what that says to me, and there's this list I have in there. You're talking about depression, anxiety, you talk about pain, you talk about Parkinson's disease and irritable bowel syndrome and certain types of addiction, perhaps. And these are things that respond, anyone who works in these, in the pharmaceutical industry trying to cure these diseases knows that the placebo effect is huge. And then you look at something like obsessive compulsive disorder or Alzheimer's disease, and it's very, very low. And what that tells me is there are rules that we can tap into, so that in certain cases, yes, this can help you live a better life. And in other cases, like if you have cancer, you really, the tumors don't respond well to belief. You may be laughing, but it doesn't work. And so learning those rules for me was really interesting, because like you said, this is tangible and this is about improving our lives, but it's knowing the rules before you do it,
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think it's very important that we are responsible with the way we share this information. It would be very dangerous to have people leave just listening to this podcast and not actually reading your book and thinking that what we're saying is just go ahead and start thinking your way to a better life, and that and to a healthier life, and just don't and there are people who sell you programs that profess that that's all you have to do. And we certainly don't want to be responsible for people not going to the doctor or trying to heal themselves. I think this just is another tool for us to be aware of. And if we understand, like you said, if we understand the rules, we understand the levers and what we can do with our brains and where we need to go outside for help, then it just opens up all kinds of interesting opportunities for learning professionals and just, human beings in general.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm really glad you said that. This is not the secret. This is, this is a different thing, and the scientists, roll their eyes at some of the things that their work gets translated into. But I think, there's this balance between, wow, this is so incredible. Some days I can't even believe what I'm reading, and then understanding, what we're actually talking about and what the rules are and how this can be responsibly used. And a lot of that, I think people are searching for that in their own life a lot. And that's the good news, is that, a lot of this is up to you to sort of figure out how you want to incorporate. But
yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, everybody, the book again is called Suggestible You by Erik Vance. And Erik, what are you most excited about? What are you working on for next time?
Oh, I've got I've got a number of things. I'm really, I write about the environment a lot, and I'm excited to go back out and do some more ocean stories. I did a story on great white sharks last year. But every time I try, I get kind of sucked back into this this topic because it's so hypnotic. But I am actually looking at a book idea along the lines of human development, and that's sort of my next hope, is that I'll get into some of the human development interesting angles. But I may just get sucked back into this suggestibility world. It really is hard to leave.
Yeah, so well. We'll have you back with your next book. Let me know when you're ready, and we'd love to have you again.
Absolutely. And if you want to check out the book or appearances that I'm making around the country, go to suggestible-you.com.
Okay, suggestible-you.com, and they can buy the book. They can see where you're appearing, and probably follow you on Twitter and all kinds of good things like that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you, Erik Vance. Everybody, the contact information and his website is listed just below where you turned on the podcast. So check it out. And thanks again, Erik. And everybody, tune in next time for another episode of the Learning to Go podcast.